At exactly 3 a.m., the high-definition feed of the nursery flickered to life, casting a clinical blue glow over Min-jun Shin's tattooed knuckles. In the sterile silence of the Shin estate, a house built on the iron rules of the Korean underworld, only the soft, rhythmic hum of the air filtration system dared to breathe. Min-jun sat in his leather chair, a man who had mastered the art of seeing without being seen. He was 35, powerful, and utterly alone, watching a screen that connected him to the only thing he had left, his 4-month-old daughter, Nari, and the American stranger he had hired to watch her.
Before I tell you what happened next to Helen Anderson, if you are already enjoying this story, hit the like button, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. This video will leave you astonished. Now, let's dive into it.
The Shin estate sat atop the rugged cliffs of Seoul like a fortress of glass and obsidian, a monument to a man who ruled the city's shadows. Inside, the air didn't just feel conditioned, it felt scrubbed of all warmth, sterilized to match the temperament of its master. Every surface was a study in excess and isolation. Polished black marble floors that mirrored the ceiling's cold, recessed lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the sprawling neon veins of the city, yet felt miles away from the pulse of humanity. To the world, Min-jun Shin was the untouchable heir to the Shin Syndicate, a man whose word could move shipping containers across oceans or silence a rival with a single glance. To those within these walls, he was a ghost who haunted his own palace. Min-jun stood by the window of his private study, his silhouette sharp against the shimmering skyline. He was barely 35, yet his presence carried the weight of a century's worth of cynicism. His jet-black hair was swept back with a precision that bordered on the obsessive, and his tailored suit fit him like a layer of armor. He didn't move as the heavy oak doors groaned open. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift in the room's pressure. "The girl is here, Chairman." A gravelly voice spoke from the shadows of the doorway. It was Dae-soo, his head of security, a man whose face was a map of scars and unspoken loyalties. Min-jun turned slowly, his eyes, dark and unreadable, fixed on the figure standing behind his commander. Helen Anderson looked like a splash of color in a world of monochrome. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, and she looked desperately small against the soaring height of the foyer's arches. She clutched the strap of a worn leather duffel bag, her fingers white-knuckled. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical, modest bun, but a few loose strands framed a face that was soft, unadorned, and currently pale with a cocktail of awe and terror. She was an American, a daughter of the working class who had come to Korea seeking a new beginning. Unaware, she had walked into the mouth of a dragon's lair. To Min-jun, she wasn't a person yet. She was a variable, a potential leak, a possible pawn for his enemies. "You are late," Min-jun said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the chill of the Han River in winter. Helen jumped slightly, her eyes snapping to his. She bowed awkwardly, a gesture she had clearly practiced but hadn't yet mastered. I am so sorry, Mr. Shin. The transit from the airport was—" "I do not care for the logistics of your failures," he interrupted, stepping into the light. The blue-black ink of the tattoos on his hands shimmered under the halogen lamps. "You are here for one reason. My daughter, Nari, requires a presence that is not mine. You will provide the labor. You will follow the schedule. You will be invisible." Helen swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I understand, sir. I just want to help. I've worked with children my whole life, and—" "You are not here to help," Min-jun corrected, his tone hardening. "You are here to occupy a space. Do not mistake my necessity for trust. In this house, trust is a luxury we burned long ago." He gestured to Dae-soo, who stepped forward to take Helen's bag. The movement was brusque, making Helen flinch. She felt the crushing weight of the house pressing down on her. The silence was so absolute it made her ears ring. There were no photos on the walls, no stray toys on the expensive rugs, no scent of cooking or life. It was a museum for a man who had forgotten how to live. "The nursery is on the 3rd floor," Minjun stated, turning back to the window, effectively dismissing her. "The staff will provide you with your uniform. Red, so I can see you coming on the monitors. Do not enter any room that is not assigned to you. Do not speak to me unless I speak to you, and most importantly, do not let the child cry. I find the sound distracting." Helen lingered for a moment, her mouth opening as if to offer a word of comfort, or perhaps to ask about the mother who was so conspicuously absent from the environment. But the cold set of Minjun's shoulders stopped her. He was a man made of stone and secrets, a king on an iron throne who viewed his own child as a duty rather than a miracle. As Dae-soo led her away, her footsteps echoing hollowly against the marble, Helen looked back one last time. Minjun hadn't moved. He was staring at his own reflection in the glass, his jaw tight, his hand gripping a small remote control in his pocket. She felt a sudden sharp pang of pity that overrode her fear. She realized that for all the gold and glass, this was the loneliest place she had ever entered. She thought of the baby, Nari, tucked away in a corner of this cold fortress, and she held her breath. High above in his command center, Minjun waited until the doors clicked shut. He sat down and pressed a button on his desk. A dozen screens flickered to life, showing every angle of the mansion. He found the camera in the hallway and watched the small, red-clad figure of Helen as she was led toward the nursery. "Let's see who you really are, Helen Anderson," he whispered to the empty room. He didn't know then that the girl who looked so out of place in his world was the only one who truly understood the language of the heart. He didn't know that by watching her, he was about to be forced to look at himself. For now, there was only the silence, the monitors, and the cold, unyielding reign of the Shin family. The clock on the wall shifted to 11 p.m. The first night of the surveillance had begun. The nursery was located at the end of a long, hushed corridor on the 3rd floor, behind a door of heavy, soundproofed oak that seemed to be designed to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep the life within from disturbing the rest of the house. When Helen stepped inside, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was the visual manifestation of a broken heart. The room was vast, larger than the entire apartment Helen had grown up in, but it lacked the cluttered, chaotic joy that usually defines a child's space. It was a showroom of wealth, a catalog of the most expensive items money could buy, yet it felt as hollow as a tomb. There were hand-carved rocking horses from Italy made of dark, somber wood, shelves lined with porcelain dolls that stared with glassy, unblinking eyes, and a crib fashioned from wrought iron and silk that looked more like a cage than a bed. Every toy was perfectly aligned, every blanket folded with surgical precision. There was no scent of baby powder or warm milk, only the faint, clinical smell of lavender-scented disinfectant. In the center of this opulent void sat Nari. The 4-month-old was a tiny, fragile anchor in the sea of expensive stillness. She lay on her back, her dark eyes tracking the slow, rhythmic rotation of a gold-plated mobile that hung above her. She didn't coo or kick her legs with the usual vigor of an infant. She seemed to have adapted to the house's requirement for silence. The heavy door creaked and Minjun entered. He didn't rush to the crib. He didn't smile. He walked with the measured, heavy tread of a man inspecting a factory floor. He stopped a few feet away from the iron crib, his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp jawline tight. He looked down at his daughter not with the wonder of a father, but with the wearied detachment of a man surveying a complicated debt. To Minjun, Nari was the living embodiment of the ultimate betrayal, Every time he looked at the curve of her cheek or the shape of her eyes, he saw the woman who had walked on them both, the wife who had found the life of a Mafia queen too suffocating and the role of a mother too demanding. He had tried to scrub her memory from the house, burning her clothes and erasing her name from the legal documents, but he couldn't erase the DNA she had left behind. Nari was a problem that required a solution, a biological responsibility that he had delegated to staff because he was terrified that if he got too close, he would find only resentment where love should be. "She has been quiet today," Min-jun remarked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He didn't look at Helen, who stood by the door, still clutching her apron. "She's a very good baby, sir," Helen whispered, stepping closer to the crib. "But maybe she's just lonely. Babies need to hear voices. They need to be held." Min-jun's eyes flicked at Helen, sharp and cold as shards of obsidian. "She has the best medical care in the country. She has a dedicated staff. She has security that most world leaders would envy. She is not lonely. She is provided for." He turned back to the child, his expression flickering for a fraction of a second, a shadow of pain crossing his face, before being replaced by his usual mask of iron. He saw Nari reach out a small, grasping hand toward him, her fingers curling in the empty air. A normal father would have reached down, offered a finger for her to grab, or swept her into his arms. Min-jun simply moved his hand to his pocket, gripping the remote control for the security system. The previous nanny complained that she cried too much at night. Min-jun said, his tone clinical. "I expect you to be more efficient. If she is distressed, find the cause and fix it. Do not let her emotions leak into the rest of the house. I have enough ghosts to contend with without adding the wailing of a child to the list." Helen felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at the gold-plated mobile, then at the man who seemed to have everything and yet possessed nothing of any real value. She realized that the ghost of a wife wasn't just a memory of the woman who left, it was the lingering spirit of the love that had died with her. Min-jun was treating his daughter like a ticking bomb, something to be managed and contained rather than a soul to be nurtured. "She isn't a ghost, Mr. Shin," Helen said, her voice trembling but brave. "She's a baby. She doesn't have a schedule for her heart." Min-jun stiffened. The air in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. He turned his head just enough to catch Helen in his peripheral vision. "Your job is to ensure her physical well-being and her silence. Do not presume to lecture me on the heart. You are an employee, Helen. Remember that when the sun goes down and the house grows dark. You are being watched, not for your opinions, but for your performance." Without another word, he turned and strode out of the room, the heavy oak door thudding shut behind him with the finality of a gavel. Helen was left alone in the golden-hued silence. She walked to the crib and looked down at Nari. The baby was still staring upward, her small hand still hovering in the air where her father had been standing. Helen reached down and gently took the tiny hand in hers. Nari's fingers immediately squeezed tight, a desperate, instinctive grip. "It's okay, little one," Helen whispered, her eyes stinging. "I see you. Even if he won't look, I see you." High above, in the darkened surveillance room, Min-jun sat down in front of his wall of monitors. He adjusted the feed for the nursery, zooming in until Helen's face filled the screen. He watched her touch his daughter's hand. He watched the way her expression softened into something he hadn't seen in years, genuine, unforced compassion. He felt a strange, uncomfortable heat behind his eyes, a sensation he quickly suppressed with a sharp breath. He told himself he was just looking for a reason to fire her. He told himself he was just waiting for her to fail. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, he found he couldn't turn the screen off. He was a man who lived in the dark, watching a small circle of light, waiting for a miracle he didn't believe in to finally happen. In the subterranean quiet of the estate's security wing, Min-jun sat enveloped by the hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic flickering of 64 liquid crystal displays. This was his sanctuary, a cockpit of glass and silicon where the world was reduced to vectors and data points. To Min-jun, the human eye was a flawed instrument, blinded by emotion and distracted by beauty. But the camera was objective. It was a witness that never blinked, a sentinel that never slept. His philosophy was a simple, brutal inheritance from the streets of Busan. To see was to survive, and to be seen was to be vulnerable. He leaned forward, the blue light of the monitors tracing the sharp, masculine symmetry of his face and catching the slight, unsettled raise of his brow. His gloved hand, the skin beneath etched with the sprawling black ink of the Shin Syndicate, tightened around a small, high-definition lens no larger than a shirt button. This was the latest intrusion, a pinnacle of surveillance technology capable of capturing the rise and fall of a chest from 50 feet in total darkness. "The girl is too quiet, Dae-soo," Min-jun murmured, his voice barely audible over the electronic whir. Dae-soo stood behind him, a motionless shadow. "She has followed every instruction, Chairman. She has not asked a single question about the business or the perimeter." "That is exactly why she is dangerous," Min-jun countered, his lips slightly parted as he caught his breath in a moment of sharp focus. "No one is that content with silence unless they are hiding the sound of their own footsteps. She is American. She is young. She should be complaining about the isolation or the hours. Instead, she smiles at a child who doesn't know her name. It's a performance. Everyone has a price, and everyone is sent by someone." He stood up, his tall, broad-shouldered frame casting a long shadow across the bank of screens. He walked toward the elevator that would take him back to the third floor. In his pocket, he felt the weight of the new camera. He was convinced that Helen Anderson was not just a maid, but a sophisticated plant, perhaps sent by the rival Park family or a government agency looking for a crack in the Shin Foundation. They had used the baby as the bait, knowing he was forced to hire an outsider to avoid the internal leaks of his own organization. When he reached the nursery, he waited until he knew Helen was in the kitchen preparing the evening bottle. The room was bathed in the dim, artificial twilight of the nightlights. He moved with practiced grace of a predator, his polished shoes making no sound on the plush rugs. He approached a large, oversized teddy bear, a gift from a business associate that had sat untouched in the corner since Nari's birth. With a surgical blade, he made a tiny incision in the plush fabric of the bear's eye. He tucked the lens inside, threading the microwire through the stuffing and down into the floor molding. As he worked, his veins were visible in his hands, a sign of the subtle tension that never truly left his body. He wasn't just installing a camera, he was building a cage.
"To see is to survive," he whispered to the empty room, the mantra acting as a shield against the sudden, irrational pang of guilt that pricked at his conscience. He looked over at the crib where Nari lay, a small, peaceful shape under the silk blankets. For a moment, he felt like a thief in his own home. He was stealing the only thing Helen had, her privacy. But he quickly crushed the feeling. Survival demanded the death of sentiment. He returned to his command center and settled into his leather chair, elbows near his knees, body engaged and leaning forward. He pressed a key, and the new feed blossomed onto the central monitor. The perspective was chillingly intimate. From the height of the teddy bear, the camera looked directly into the crib and at the chair where Helen sat during the long night shifts. He watched as Helen returned to the room. She didn't look around with the suspicious eyes of a spy. She didn't search the drawers or listen at the vents. She simply walked to the crib, checked Nari's temperature with a gentle touch of her knuckles, and sat down. She looked tired. Her shoulders lacked the rigid posture of his soldiers, but she looked grounded. Min-jun gripped the remote control, his thumb hovering over the record button. He was a god in this room, an invisible deity watching over a curated world.
He was certain that under the pressure of the 3 a.m. exhaustion, the mask would slip. He would catch her looking for his ledgers, or perhaps showing a flicker of the same resentment he felt every time he looked at the child. "Show me your true face, Helen," he muttered to the screen. He sat there for hours, a man trapped in his own web of surveillance. He was so busy looking for a traitor that he didn't realize he was watching the only person in the house who was truly free. The glowing screens surrounded him like a digital fortress, keeping him safe, keeping him informed, and keeping him entirely alone. He was a master of the art of seeing, but as the night deepened, he was still entirely blind to the truth that was beginning to unfold right in front of his eyes. The sun rose over Seoul, not as a herald of warmth, but as a harsh spotlight on the unrelenting rhythm of the Shin estate. For Helen, the days were a blurred montage of labor that left her bones aching with a weariness she had never known. She moved through the mansion like a red and white specter, her slender frame perpetually bowed under the weight of chores that seemed designed to break her spirit. While the other household staff, all local and fiercely loyal to the syndicate, spoke in hushed, rapid Korean, Helen remained an island of isolation. They treated her with a cold, sharp-edged disdain, intentionally leaving the heaviest tasks for the American girl and whispering behind their hands as she passed. She was the outsider, the interloper in a world that valued blood and tradition above all else. During the morning scrub, the head housekeeper would intentionally tip over a bucket of gray water just as Helen finished a floor, forcing her to start again. In the laundry, the others would accidentally misplace the specific detergents needed for Nari's delicate linens and watch with narrow eyes as Helen spent an hour hand-washing the silk blankets until her knuckles were raw. Yet she never snapped. She never complained. She remained emotionally grounded, her soft eyes reflecting a quiet resilience that the others mistook for weakness. Min-jun watched it all, from his various offices, on his tablet during transit, and in the deep stillness of his private study. His eyes were perpetually fixed on the digital ghost of Helen Anderson. He watched her encounter the petty cruelties of his staff, expecting to see her face contort with the same bitterness that fueled his own life. He waited for her to steal a moment of rest, to hide in a corner and weep, or to lash out at a fellow servant. But the slip-up he craved never materialized. Instead, he saw her find small, invisible ways to stay human. One afternoon, the monitor in his study captured Helen in the grand dining hall. She was on her knees, scrubbing the base of a massive mahogany table that could seat 40. The camera, hidden within the intricate carving of a ceiling molding, zoomed in on her face. She looked exhausted, her brown hair escaping its bun in damp strands, but she was focused. Min-jun watched as she finished a section of the floor and then, inexplicably, stopped. She looked at a single spot on the marble, a faint, stubborn stain from a spilled wine glass years prior. She began to scrub that spot again. Then again. She was cleaning the same spot twice, putting more effort into a microscopic flaw than the task required. To Min-jun, this was the behavior of someone obsessed with detail, or someone trying to bury a secret in physical exertion. He leaned forward, his brows slightly raised, his tattooed hand tightening around the remote. Was this a signal? Was she checking for a hidden compartment? "What are you looking for, Helen?" he whispered to the screen, his breath hitching as he watched her work. But as he zoomed in closer, he saw that she wasn't searching. Her lips were moving. She was humming a low, wordless tune, her head tilted toward the floor. She wasn't scrubbing to hide something. She was scrubbing as a form of meditation, a way to keep her mind from shattering in the silence of his cold house. When she finally finished, she sat back on her heels for a brief second, wiping sweat from her brow with her sleeve. She looked at her reflection in the polished stone, smoothed her stained white apron, and then immediately moved to the next task. The stain on her apron was a map of her day, a smear of baby formula, a streak of dust, a drop of the gray water the housekeeper had spilled. To Min-jun, that apron was a symbol of everything he found distasteful about the working class. The mess, the struggle, the lack of control. Yet, as he watched her move through the house, he found himself increasingly bothered by the way his own staff treated her. He saw the head gardener ignore her polite greeting in the courtyard. He saw the cook shove a plate of cold leftovers for her for dinner without a word. A strange, foreign sensation began to stir in Min-jun's chest. Not quite empathy, but a sharp, biting irritation. It offended his sense of order that his employees felt empowered to bully someone who had not yet proven herself an enemy. He gripped the remote, his thumb hovering over the intercom button to reprimand the housekeeper. But he stopped himself. He couldn't intervene. To intervene would be to acknowledge her humanity, and that was a border he refused to cross. By the time the moon hung over the city, Helen's day was far from over. She returned to the nursery, her movements slower now, the weight of the day's labor visible in the slump of her shoulders. She didn't go to her bed. She went to Nadi's crib. Min-jun watched the feed from the teddy bear's eye, his eyes wide and focused. Helen stood over the baby, looking down at the small, sleeping form. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, a Korean English dictionary page she had printed out. He watched her mouth the words, her brow furrowing in concentration as she practiced the sounds of a language that wasn't hers. She was exhausted, her bones likely aching like his own did after a night of syndicate negotiations. But she was using her final thread of energy to learn how to speak to his child. He felt a loss of control, a subtle tremor in his hand that made the remote rattle against his knee. He was used to commanding fear, but he had no idea how to command the feeling of guilt that was slowly rising like a tide. He looked at the stained apron on the screen, and then at his own perfectly tailored jet black sleeve. He was the one in the suit, the one with the cameras and the power, yet he felt strangely smaller than the girl on the screen. 24 hours, he muttered, checking the time. She hasn't broken yet. He sat back in his chair, the glowing screens casting his sharp features into deep shadow. He was a man who lived for the reveal, the moment the target showed their true, ugly self. But as the clock ticked toward 3 a.m., he began to realize that Helen's true face might be exactly what she was showing him, and that thought was more terrifying than any betrayal he had ever faced. The digital clock on the command console flipped to 3 a.m. with a silent, clinical precision. In the heavy, subterranean darkness of the surveillance suite, the air was cold enough to bite, but Min-jun did not feel it. He was a man suspended in a state of high tensile alertness, his tall, broad-shouldered frame coiled like a spring in the leather chair. His eyes, wide and unsettled, were fixed on the central monitor, the feed from the teddy bear's eye. Suddenly, the silence was pierced by a thin, buzzing hiss. It was the sound of the baby monitor, a sharp electronic crackle that seemed to vibrate through Min-jun's very bones. He leaned forward, his elbows digging into his knees, his face inches from the screen. In his tattooed right hand, he gripped the remote control so tightly the veins stood out like marble ridges against his skin. He was the one in the suit, the one with the cameras and the power, yet he felt strangely smaller than the girl on the screen. 24 hours, he muttered, checking the time. She hasn't broken yet.
Then Neri began to cry. It wasn't the sharp, demanding scream of a hungry child, but a weak, fragile whimpering, the sound of a baby lost in the vast, loveless silence of a house that didn't want her. "Now," Min-jun whispered, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried a jagged edge of anticipation. He watched Helen's form stir. She didn't move with the practiced speed of a professional. She moved with the agonizing slowness of someone whose muscles were screaming in protest. He watched her sit up, her brown hair falling in a messy, practical bun over one shoulder, her fair skin looking ghostly in the infrared light. For a long, pulsing minute, she simply sat there, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with a silent, bone-deep yawn. Min-jun's thumb hovered over the zoom button. He was ready to catch the look of resentment he was certain would be there. He expected to see her check her watch with an angry huff, or perhaps let the baby cry for a few minutes while she gathered the energy to care. He had seen it before with the others, the subtle eye rolls, the rough handling of the blankets, the clinical, detached way they treated his problem. He waited for the neglect that would justify his paranoia and allow him to retreat back into the safety of his cynicism. But Helen didn't check the time. She didn't even turn on the light. She stood up, her feet bare on the cold floor, and moved toward the iron crib. She didn't walk like a servant approaching a task. She moved like a woman drawn to a heartbeat. Min-jun watched through the graining black and white footage as she reached down and gathered Neri into her arms. She didn't just pick her up. She cradled the infant against her chest, supporting her head and back with a focused tenderness that made Min-jun's breath hitch in his throat. He zoomed in. He wanted to see her eyes. He wanted to find the lie. But as the image enlarged, he saw only a terrifying, grounded steadiness. Helen's face was calm, her features softened by a look of pure, focused care that was entirely devoid of fear. She wasn't performing for him. She didn't know about the eye in the teddy bear or the man in the basement whose heart was currently drumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Neri's whimpering didn't stop immediately. The baby was restless, her small hands batting at the air as if searching for a ghost. Min-jun watched Helen begin to sway, a slow, rhythmic movement that seemed to sync with the hum of the house. He saw her lips move, not in a command for silence, but in a whisper that he couldn't hear. The remote in his hand felt suddenly heavy, an intrusion of cold plastic in a moment that felt increasingly sacred. He felt a moral discomfort, a sense that he was committing a crime more significant than any syndicate hit. He was intruding into a world of innocence and purity that he had long ago declared extinct. "Why aren't you angry?" he muttered, his lips slightly parted as he caught himself mid-breath. "She is not your blood. I am not your friend. Why do you hold her like she is your whole world?"
Helen sat down in the rocking chair, the stained white apron of her uniform rustling softly. She tucked the baby's head under her chin and closed her eyes, a look of peace settling over her tired face. In that moment, the power dynamic of the Shin estate was utterly inverted. Min-jun sat in his multi-million-dollar command center, surrounded by armed men and godlike authority, yet he felt like the beggar, watching a woman who owned nothing offer a wealth of love that he couldn't buy. He leaned back, his broad shoulders finally relaxing against the leather, though the tension in his mind only tightened. He didn't turn off the monitor. He couldn't. He was a man used to commanding fear, but he was currently a prisoner of his own surveillance, forced to witness the very thing he had spent years trying to destroy: hope. As the 3 a.m. silence reclaimed the nursery, Helen began to hum, a low, melodic sound that bypassed the electronic speakers and seemed to vibrate directly in Min-jun's chest. He didn't recognize the tune yet, but he recognized the feeling. It was the sound of a wall beginning to crumble. In the beep, shadowed hours of the night, the nursery was a world of its own, far removed from the cold steel and blood debt politics of the Shin Empire. Helen sat in the rocking chair, her movements fluid and instinctive as she cradled Nari against her chest. The baby was still restless, her tiny face pinched with a phantom distress that no amount of expensive silk or temperature-controlled air could soothe. High above, in the glowing heart of the surveillance room, Min-jun leaned so close to the monitor that the digital pixels danced across his wide, unsettled eyes. He held his breath, his tattooed hand hovering over the remote's volume dial. He was waiting for the moment Helen would give up, the moment she would lay the crying child back down and retreat into the resentful silence he understood. But Helen didn't give up. She shifted Nari closer, pressing her cheek against the infant's sparse, soft hair. Then she began to whisper. At first, the sound was nothing more than a melodic hum, a vibration that traveled through the electronic speakers and seemed to vibrate directly in Min-jun's chest.
He didn't recognize the tune yet, but he recognized the feeling. It was the sound of a wall beginning to crumble. Arirang, arirang, arario. Minjun's hand dropped from the console. The remote clattered against the floor, forgotten. He felt a sharp, icy shock radiate through his chest, as if the obsidian walls of his mansion had suddenly collapsed. He knew that song. It was the arirang, the unofficial anthem of his people, a song of parting and longing, of a sorrow so deep it became beautiful. It was the song his mother had sung to him in the tiny, cramped apartment in Busan before the world had turned him into a monster. He watched the screen with a loss of control that terrified him. Helen wasn't just singing, she was performing an act of radical empathy. She saw her lips move with agonizing precision as she navigated the unfamiliar language, her brow furrowed in the same way it had been when he caught her studying the crumpled dictionary page earlier that week. She had been studying in the dark. She had spent her few precious minutes of rest learning the sounds of a culture that had treated her with nothing but disdain. She wasn't just trying to quiet a baby, she was trying to give Nari a piece of the identity her father had tried to bury. She was bridging the gap between a poor maid and a mafia boss using nothing but a broken lullaby. Arirang gogero no moganda. The melody was hauntingly fragile. In the black and white grain of the security feed, Helen looked like a figure from a forgotten dream. Her fair skin and tired eyes were bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight, her presence a stark contrast to the sharp, masculine symmetry of the room's design. She looked emotionally grounded, her calm face a mirror of the innocence she held in her arms. Minjun's heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm. He looked at Nari and, for the first time, he didn't see a problem to be solved or a ghost of a wife. He saw a child who had finally found home in the arms of a stranger. Nari's small hands, which had been batting at the air in distress, slowly relaxed, her fingers curling into the fabric of Helen's red uniform. The baby sighed, a tiny, contented sound that bypassed the monitors and pierced Minjun's cynicism. He leaned back, his tall frame suddenly feeling too heavy for the chair. He felt a wave of guilt so profound it made his vision blur. He had watched this woman for weeks, waiting for her to steal, waiting for her to lie, waiting for her to betray the very blood she was currently honoring. He had treated her like a target under a microscope, never realizing that he was the one being exposed. The surveillance room, with its 64 screens and its godlike authority, suddenly felt like a tomb. The blue light of the monitors felt cold and sickly. He looked at his tattooed hands, the hands that had signed off on hits and orchestrated the movement of contraband, and realized they had never held his daughter with a fraction of the grace he was witnessing on the screen. "You're not an enemy," he whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking. He watched Helen finish the song. She leaned down and kissed Nari's forehead, a lingering, tender gesture that was entirely unscripted and unseen, except for him. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look for approval. She simply sat there in the 3 a.m. silence, holding the child of a man who terrified her, singing the songs of a country that ignored her. Minjun stood up. He didn't turn off the monitors this time. He just stood there, his sharp jawline trembling, his eyes fixed on the image of the maid and the baby. The art of surveillance had finally failed him. He had seen everything, but for the first time in his life, he was finally beginning to understand. The dragon was no longer watching a pawn. He was watching the only soul in his house that wasn't for sale. As the last notes of the arirang faded into the hushed stillness of the nursery, Minjun realized that the silence he had built to protect himself was gone. It had been replaced by a melody that demanded a response. a response that would require him to finally step out of the shadows and face the light. In the cold, clinical darkness of the surveillance suite, the air seemed to thin, becoming as sharp as a blade. Min-jun sat frozen, his tall frame no longer projecting the rigid authority of the Shin Syndicate, but rather the fractured silhouette of a man coming undone. On the central monitor, the image of Helen cradling Nari remained, a soft, golden pocket of humanity in a world he had spent years turning into a fortress of ice. The final notes of her whispered arirang continued to echo in his mind, more deafening than the roar of the Seoul traffic or the hum of the servers surrounding him. He looked down at his right hand, the one still hovering near the console. The tattooed ink of the dragon that coiled around his wrist and onto his knuckle seemed to mock him. It was a symbol of fire and strength, of a predator that took what it wanted and crushed what it feared. Yet, as he watched the poor maid on the screen, he realized that he was truly powerless. He had all the cameras, all the guards, and all the wealth. But he was a beggar staring through a window at a warmth he didn't know how to earn. The guilt hit him then, a physical blow that forced the air from his lungs. It wasn't just the intrusion of the camera hidden in the teddy bear's eye. It was the realization of what he had been looking for. He had been so desperate to find a flaw in Helen, so hungry to catch her in a moment of neglect, because her failure would have justified his own. If she were just a maid looking for a paycheck, then his distance as a father was acceptable. But she wasn't just a maid. She was a bridge to a heritage he had abandoned, providing a soul to a child he had treated like a biological obligation. A single hot tear escaped the corner of his eye, tracing a path down his sharp jawline. It felt like fire against his skin. He didn't wipe it away. He sat there, his lips slightly parted, caught in a mid-breath of realization that made his chest ache. He thought of the weeks he had spent watching her scrub the same spot on the floor twice, the way he had ignored her soft hello in the hallways, and the clinical way he had ordered her to fix his daughter's distress. He had treated her like a machine, while she had been treating his daughter like the miracle she was. He leaned forward, his elbows digging into his knees, and buried his face in his hands. The Mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man who was drowning in the silence of his own creation. He could see it all so clearly now, the way Nari's small hand had reached for him in the nursery, and how he retreated into his pocket to grip a remote control instead of his child's fingers. He had used surveillance as a shield against the ghost of his wife, but in doing so, he had become a ghost himself. On the monitor, Helen began to sway again, a gentle, grounding motion that seemed to soothe the very air in the nursery. She looked peaceful, entirely unaware that her every breath was being weighed by a man in a basement. That was the deepest sting of all. Her love was pure because it was unperformed. She didn't need an audience to be a saint. He was the only one who needed an audience to feel like a king. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the word scratching his throat. It was a phrase he hadn't uttered in a decade, a confession that felt alien in the mouth of a dragon. He wasn't just apologizing to Helen for the cameras. He was apologizing to the memory of his mother for forgetting her songs, and to Nari for the months of cold, marble-hard silence. The blue light of the screens began to feel suffocating, a digital cage of his own making. He looked at the remote control sitting on the console, the symbol of his godlike authority. With a sudden, jerky movement, he reached out and pressed the master power button. One by one, the 64 screens flickered into blackness. The nursery vanished. The hallways disappeared. The art of surveillance was over. For the first time since Nari's birth, Min-jun sat in total, unmonitored darkness. He let the tears fall freely now, his broad shoulders shaking with the weight of a grief he had been carrying since the day he took his father's throne. He realized that to save his daughter, he had to destroy the man he had become. He had to stop being the observer and start being the father. He stayed in that darkness for a long time, listening to the sound of his own ragged breathing. The dragon had been broken, not by an enemy's blade, but by a lullaby sung in a language of love he thought he had forgotten. When he finally stood up, his movements were no longer the calculated strides of a boss, but the hesitant steps of a man looking for a way home. He didn't need the cameras anymore. He knew exactly where he needed to go. The darkness of the surveillance suite had become a mirror, and Min-jun could no longer bear to look at the man reflected in the black screens. He rose from his leather chair, the movement stiff and deliberate. The remote control, once his scepter of digital omniscience, lay abandoned on the console like a piece of discarded plastic. For the first time in 4 months, he was not looking at the world through a lens. He was breathing in the actual heavy air of his own isolation. He stepped out of the command center and into the corridor, and the transition felt like a physical weight being pressed against his chest. The mansion was silent, but it was no longer the silence of a well-oiled machine. To Min-jun, it sounded like a held breath. The hallway stretched before him, a long, echoing gallery of black marble and cold light that seemed to expand with every step he took.
Each footfall against the polished stone sounded like a heartbeat, loud and erratic in the stillness of the night. As he walked, Min-jun felt the armor of the chairman beginning to flake away. He passed a line of tall, narrow windows that looked out over the city, but he did not stop to survey his kingdom. He looked instead at his own hands. They were trembling. The tattoos that climbed his neck and wrapped his wrists, symbols meant to project an image of unyielding terror, felt heavy, like iron chains he had forged for himself. He had built this estate to be a fortress where no one could hurt him, only to realize he had built a tomb where no one could find him. The journey from the basement to the 3rd floor felt like a pilgrimage. He passed the heavy oak doors of the study, the dining hall where he had watched Helen scrub the floors, and the portraits of ancestors who had taught him that vulnerability was a death sentence. With every step, he was shedding the skin of the boss, the man who ruled through fear and surveillance. He was becoming, painfully and slowly, just a man. A father who had missed the first 4 months of his daughter's life because he was too afraid to see his own grief in her eyes. He reached the elevator, but he bypassed it, choosing the stairs instead. He needed to feel the exertion, the physical reality of the climb. His broad shoulders, usually squared in a posture of defiance, were now slightly rounded, carry the invisible burden of 1,000 regrets. He thought of Helen sitting in the golden glow of the nursery, unaware that the dragon was approaching the gate. He realized that for all his power, he was the one who was terrified. He was terrified of the light she carried, and even more terrified that he was too late to be warmed by it. When he finally reached the 3rd floor, the air changed. The sterile, scentless atmosphere of the lower floors gave way to something softer. He could smell the faint, lingering scent of lavender and warm milk. He stopped at the nursery door, his hand hovering over the handle. He was a man who kicked down doors and stormed rival compounds without a flicker of hesitation. Yet he stood before this simple piece of oak with a pounding heart and sweating palms. He looked at his reflection in the polished wood one last time. He saw the shark jawline, the high cheekbones, and the eyes that had watched too much and felt too little. He took a deep, shuddering breath and turned the handle. He didn't use his master key. He didn't barge in with the authority of the master of the house. He pushed the door open slowly, a silent plea for entry into a world he had no right to inhabit. The light from the hallway spilled into the room, cutting a long, bright path across the rug toward the rocking chair. Min-jun stepped across the threshold, leaving the shadows of the hallway behind. He was no longer the observer behind a screen. He was a man stepping into the light, ready to face the truth of what he had lost and the hope of what he might still find.
The dragon had arrived at the nursery, but he had left his fire at the door. He was just a father, standing in the presence of a miracle, waiting to see if there was still room for him in the song. The heavy oak door creaked on its hinges, a sound that felt like a thunderclap in the fragile stillness of the nursery. Helen bolted upright in the rocking chair, her heart leaping into her throat. Nari, startled by the sudden shift, let out a soft, confused whimper. When Helen looked up and saw the towering silhouette of Minjun Shin framed in the doorway, her blood turned to ice. He looked different. The man who usually occupied the doorway with the sharp, predatory grace of a conqueror now stood with his shoulders slumped, his chest heaving as if he had run a marathon. His jet black hair was disheveled, and his eyes, usually so cold and unreadable, were rimmed with a raw, unmistakable redness. For a terrifying heartbeat, Helen thought she had finally crossed an invisible line. She clutched Nari tighter to her chest, her fair skin paling against the red of her uniform. "Mr. Shin," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I'm sorry. She wouldn't sleep, and I thought—" She began to rise, ready to bow, ready to apologize for the distraction of her voice, but Minjun moved faster than she had ever seen. He didn't move toward her with anger. He took 2 stumbling steps into the room and then stopped, his knees nearly buckling. He didn't look at Helen with the suspicion of a boss. He looked at her with the desperation of a drowning man. "Don't stop," he rasped. His voice was no longer a melodic command. It was a broken, jagged thing. "The song, please, don't stop." Helen froze, her breath hitching. She looked from his tattooed hands to his tear-streaked face, the reality of the moment finally piercing through her fear. He wasn't there to fire her. He wasn't there to reprimand her for the broken Cryin she had been whispering into the dark. He was there because the song had reached him in his fortress. Minjun looked down at Nari, who had fallen silent, her dark eyes wide and fixed on her father. For the first time, he didn't see a reminder of a faithless wife or a burden to be managed. He saw a small, innocent soul who was waiting for him to come home. He reached out a hand, his fingers shaking violently, and for the first time in 4 months, he didn't retreat. He let his knuckles graze the baby's velvet-soft cheek. "I have spent my life watching," Minjun said, his voice dropping to a vulnerable whisper. "Watching for enemies. Watching for lies. I watched you through a lens because I didn't believe anyone could be this good." He looked up at Helen, his expression of profound, agonizing guilt. "I saw everything, Helen, and I realized I am the only one in this house who is truly blind." Helen felt the tension drain out of her, replaced by a wave of heat that brought tears to her own eyes. She didn't ask about the cameras. She didn't need to. She saw the remote control peeking out of his pocket and the way he looked at his daughter, and she understood that the dragon had been slain by a lullaby.
"She's been waiting for you, sir," Helen said softly, her voice steadying. Minjun sank onto the edge of the ottoman, his broad-shouldered frame looking smaller, more human. He looked at the baby, then back at Helen. "The song you were singing, the Arirang. My mother, she used to sing it when the world was too loud. I thought I had forgotten the words. I thought I had buried them under the marble and the blood." He reached out, his tattooed hand hovering over Nari. "Teach me," he whispered. "Teach me how to sing to her. Teach me how to be her father." Helen's heart swelled. She slowly shifted Nari, offering the infant to the man who had been a stranger to his own flesh. Minjun hesitated for a second, his hands hovering in the air, as if he were afraid he would break something so pure. Then he gathered her in. The first hug was clumsy, a tangle of tailored wool and soft baby blankets, but it was the most honest thing that had ever happened in the Shin estate. As Minjun pulled his daughter against his chest, Nari didn't cry. She reached up, her tiny hand catching the lapel of his black suit, and let out a soft, contented coo. Minjun buried his face in the baby's neck, his shoulders shaking as the last of his iron mask dissolved into silent, redemptive sobs. "Arirang, Arirang," Helen prompted softly, her voice a gentle guide.
Minjun repeated the words, his deep, masculine voice joining hers. It was a broken, imperfect sound, but as the two of them sat in the golden glow of the nursery, the heavy, suffocating silence of the mansion was finally, permanently shattered. The Korean Mafia boss was gone, and in his place was a father, finally learning the language of the heart. The sun began to bleed over the Seoul skyline, but for the first time, the light didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a beginning. In the nursery, the maid and the boss sat together, no longer separated by glass or suspicion, but united by the tiny heartbeat between them. The dragon had found his way home, and he had done it through the songs of a girl who had seen him even when he was hiding in the dark.